All right, everyone. Welcome to Deploying and Managing SQL Server with DBA Tools. I'm Anthony Nocentino. My pronouns are he and him. I'm an enterprise architect at Centino Systems. I will be honest with you all, crowd. My laptop just died and I'm on my backup laptop. So my heart rate is through the roof right now. So it's going to be an interesting ride on my backup laptop today. But like a good DBA, I had a backup. So you're at Pass Summit. I want to encourage you to explore everything that Pass has to offer. We have a Pass Pro membership available this year to sign up to get some exclusive training and networking. Pass local groups and SQL Saturdays are near and dear to my heart. I participate in those as much as I possibly can. Past marathons and volunteering are also valuable assets to our community and virtual groups as well. Please participate in those. There's a virtual group for many different interests. I do want to call out that the exhibitors and sponsors are there at the ready for you in the online exhibitor hall. And I encourage you to go ahead and visit those. I have lots of friends that are vendors. Go check them out. The worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to have a good time and some laughs and learn about some cool tech that the sponsors have available for you. So this is me, Anthony Nocentino. Like I said earlier, pronouns are he and him, enterprise architect at Centino Systems. That's my LinkedIn profile and my Twitter handle. Please follow me on Twitter if you're not already. It's my main way to interact with the community. I talk a lot about tech, blog posts, things like that that's going on in the SQL Server and Kubernetes world. I specialize in system architecture and performance. I like to design systems. I like to make things go fast. I've been a data platform MVP for the last couple of years. Thank you very much. Microsoft, and also am a Pluralsight author. I just recently finished writing a book. Keep an eye out for that with A Press with my good friend and moderator, Ben Weissman, who is on the line here with us today. So keep an eye out
Woohoo!
for that. Hello, Ben. So let's talk about what we're going to talk about. And the first thing I'm going to start off with is deployment challenges. Like, what are the things that can be difficult for us to do when we need to deploy and manage SQL Server, right? Things like installing SQL Server, installing SQL Server consistently, and also managing the configuration and at scale. Like, if you have to do this more than once, how do you get that done? Then we'll talk about the benefits of automation. Like, once we kind of realize that, well, I want to be able to do these things, right, that are challenging and solve those problems. Well, we're going to build solutions to automate those. And we'll talk about the benefits of doing that. You'll be surprised. There's some things in there that you might not think of with regards to automation and the value that it provides. Then we'll look at some automation solutions. Over the last couple of years, I've gotten to play with a lot of different technologies to roll out SQL servers at customer sites. I'm a consultant. I work in many different customer sites, so I get to play with a lot of different tech. But also, I kind of need the same tech that I can drop into an organization where it's basically something that they can just grab off the shelf and go. And DBA Tools is that tech. But we will look at some other solutions that are viable candidates to rolling out SQL Server at scale and also doing configuration management. So DBA Tools is kind of the core to this talk. Once we learn like what the challenges are, once we learn the benefits of automation and kind of the landscape of the tools available with us, but we're going to use DBA Tools, and that's going to be the majority of what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to look at a lot of code and how I solved the problems of installing SQL Server and configuring SQL Server over and over again the same way, right? Because doing things the same way, consistency is key. Once we have our stuff up and running, though, I want to introduce, maybe if you're not familiar with a technology called Pester, which is a testing framework that you can use to manage your configurations. Pester gives you the ability to basically say, is this thing, well, what I expect it to be? We'll write a bunch of tests to make sure that we're doing this that way. So if we were in person, I would do a quick survey and say, how many of you have a SQL Server installation checklist? Raise your hands, right? I was one of those up until about 3 years ago, where I had the spreadsheet that was these are all the different things that I do when I install a SQL Server, right? You do this, you install that, you put this package on there, you make these configurations to your instances, you make these configurations to your OS. And then how many of you logged into that same server a month later, a day later, a week later, whenever it is, and found that you had deviations from that standard, right? Where you're like, whoa, I built this thing, checked everything off in the checklist, and it's not that way anymore, right? Either because you messed up in the checklist, because we're humans, right? That's what we do, or someone made a configuration change to the box, right? And so this idea, though, is like, I want to get that under control because I want to be able to do these things consistently over and over and over again, and also be able to measure configuration skew, right? If something's changed from the time that I built that system, what changed, and I want to know. So I told you earlier, I'm on Twitter a lot. I took to Twitter and I asked everyone, because this is the actual survey since we couldn't do this in person, is in your environment, how many folks have an automated installation of SQL Server? And I got a pretty good chunk of responses, 115 responses. And 57% said they still log into the server and click next, 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 finish, right, to install SQL Server. Totally valid, not judgmental. And only 42%, 42.6 said they have an automated way to install SQL Server. When I say automated, I mean literally anything that's not clicking next, 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 finish. So you could be using like configuration.ini, whatever it is. And 42%. So a little less than I actually thought that was going to be, but we're going to learn today, and hopefully this session will get that number up a little bit higher. And so when we're talking about deploying SQL Server over and over again in an enterprise, or for me at customer sites where I wanted just to be able to walk in and get it done fast and get it done right every single time, the number one challenge is consistency, right? Is we're humans, right? We can't do things, well, we can. It's hard for us to do repeatable things over and over and over again the same exact way. It also gets boring, right? Who wants to install SQL servers over and over and over again? Well, except people that sell licenses. But anyway, so we also want to be able to do it quickly. The nexus of me learning automation for deploying SQL Server is I had a customer that said, hey, I need you to install 80 SQL servers like next week. And I was like, all right. And so I needed to, I could sit in a corner and click next, 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 finish and bill my customer a bunch of hours, which would have been great for me, but doesn't provide a lot of value to them. And so I'm like, hey, listen, give me a couple of days. Let me look at some solutions to solve this problem and let's figure this out. And so they gave me some time to do that. And I was able to successfully roll out a whole bunch of SQL servers consistently and very, very quickly, right? And so that's one of the challenges is if you have to react fast to do things, it's kind of hard to do when you're walking through it in a wizard. The next up is, and I've kind of introduced this topic in pretty good detail, is configuration skew, or the idea of I deployed a system and I came back to it later and it's changed. And what I want to be able to do is measure that change, like what's changed and did it change for a reason, or did somebody just have the right rights in production and made a configuration change, backstop one, to something for the entire instance. And I'll be able to measure that, determine what that change is, and then react accordingly, maybe set it back, or maybe talk to the person that changed it, or figure out why it changed, I should say. So again, the benefits of automation are going to be repeatable and consistent processes. And so today the talk is going to be about writing code to deploy and configure SQL Server. Once we have that code, we're going to be able to do it fast, right? It's going to be speed and it's going to be consistent, repeatable, and fast. And you might have heard this term, infrastructure as code. Well, that's what we're going to end up with. We're going to have code that represents how we deploy our systems. We take that code, we check it into source control, we leave it there, and then we have a configuration artifact for that particular system, which is fantastic because then I know what the desired state of my actual system is against what is actually deployed. Now here, I like to make this joke that one of the benefits of automation is that it can reduce human error, right? We talked about consistency and having server checklists and maybe not getting it right every single time, or it increases it, right? If I write automation and it does the wrong thing, I'm doing the wrong thing at scale, which can be really, really challenging too. I'm sure we've all done it. We've ran a PowerShell script or we've done something against a couple dozen servers and things got dicey real quick. So that comes down to code testing and code quality and things like that. So I do want to have a word of caution there. It's either going to reduce human error or increase it. Scale out installations. Again, being able to install many servers very quickly in a short period of time consistently. So I can say, I need one server right now, I need 3, I need 5, I need 10, and writing code to be able to support that type of deployment, right? So lesser known benefits of automation, we've already touched on this point, measuring configuration skew. Did it change from what I expected it to be or what I expect it to be? But here's one you might not think about. It's high availability. I work a lot with availability groups, and I teach a session at customer sites where it's availability group design. And my first design point that I go through in building availability groups is don't. And they're like, whoa, what do you mean? I'm like, if you have good automation and good practices and good code to support your environment, well, you might be able to just reinstall a SQL server and restore all of your databases and still meet your recovery objectives if you have good automation built around that and already have the scripts to support that. So in our demos today, you're going to see I'm going to roll out a SQL server in about 5 or 6 minutes on my test laptop. Well, today it's a video. I'll explain why later. But we're going to roll out SQL Server in 5 or 6 minutes. In enterprise class hardware, it's like 1 or 2 minutes to roll out a SQL Server, which is pretty darn quick. From there, you could lay on top your restore date, the database restores. We should be restoring our databases to measure how long it takes to restore. If that's within your recovery objectives, you've met your goals. The other one is the other lesser known benefit of automation I like to call out is troubleshooting. If I walk up to a system and we have a kind of a core baseline of our system and they're all configured in a similar way, well, I'm going to be able to detect, even in my own mind, what's changed, right? And it helps me with troubleshooting if I see things are amiss because I have the expectation that the systems in some way are fundamentally very, very similar or the same when it comes to their configuration. Now, we do have to make adjustments to certain platforms and certain configurations and things like that, whether it's max stop settings or memory settings or the size of disks and things like that. But the idea is the core essence of the systems are identical. Not every single one is a custom configuration. So what are the possible candidate solutions for us to automatically deploy SQL Server with all this cool benefits and things that I've been trying to preach at in the beginning part of the session? Well, first up, you've probably already, or you might be familiar with this one, the configuration.ini, where you write a configuration ini and you use that as a parameter into the SQL Server executable to roll out SQL Server. Totally valid way. You're not clicking next, 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 finish, right? In fact, one of my good friends replied to that Twitter thread and said, well, I don't consider this automation. I'm like, no, I genuinely think that this is an automated solution because you're defining what your system looks like and you're telling SQL Server to configure it this way. But that's really target focused towards just installing SQL Server. And so today I want to show you, we're going to expand beyond just SQL and we're going to configure the OS. And we're also going to show you some techniques on how to configure virtual machines to make sure that you're in the right configuration. So outside of configuration.ini, the next candidate solution, and this is the one that I used initially at that customer site that I described, is PowerShell DSC, desired state configuration. It's a fantastic configuration management platform. And I use the term platform intentionally rather than saying configuration management tool. The idea with DSC is it gives you kind of the core framework to build automation on. And within that framework, then you have to kind of build infrastructure and tooling around that to drive the work that DSC does. And it worked really great at the customer sites that I deployed it in. But what I found out for me as a consultant when I left, the customers weren't so interested in managing this thing anymore, the DSC. They're like, we just needed SQL servers, and now I still have this DSC stuff laying around. And it got two of the other pain points that we found, other than having to learn additional tech, was logging is a little bit tough, and also the distribution of code and the PowerShell modules within using DSC became challenging to organization. So really, it kind of just raised, not that it's bad, like it just kind of raised the technical complexity of the solution to the point where there's some friction with my customers, which is fine, but I needed a better solution. And I don't want to sound like I'm bashing DSC because it's a totally valid way to do things. In fact, there is a session tomorrow by Brandon Leach on DSC, and Jess Pomfret, who's a community leader in this technology, has fantastic resources and are doing great work with it. So it might be a valid solution in your organization. But for me as a consultant, I need to keep the tech bar as low, not want to say as low as possible, but as accessible as possible for my customers. There are off-the-shelf products that we can purchase, things like Chef and Puppet and Ansible and Chocolate, that all deploy SQL Server in an automated way. Now, if you know me, you know this has kind of been my favorite way to deploy SQL Server over the last couple of years, which is containers and Kubernetes. However, that leaves us just in the Linux space. And this solution I need to install for a wider customer base that is still on Windows. And so the solution is, and why we're probably all here, is DBA Tools, right? And so DBA Tools is a candidate solution for this problem because it gives me what I need. I can get all of that installation and all of that configuration and still keep that tech bar accessible enough that I can walk into a customer site and say, you know what, we're just going to use PowerShell. And most customers understand that that's an accessible thing for them to get their work done. And so let's move into the next part of the talk for using DBA tools for automation for both deploying and configuring SQL servers. Now, what I kind of want like, what is DBA tools? Well, it's a community-driven module that is going to effectively give us the tools to manage, configure, and deploy or install SQL Server. One of the project goals in the GitHub repo says that it's a command line SQL Server Management Studio, which means it's anything that's available in SSMS is the project goal is to implement that at the command line. So anything that you can do should be doable in DBA tools because of the SQL Server Management Objects or SMO, which is a way to expose a bunch of programmatic functionality inside of SQL Server. And having that nice stable interface into SMO means that we're getting good, rich code that's maintained by the Microsoft engineering team. And then this PowerShell module is built on top of that. So when it comes to getting DBA tools, it's available to you in the PowerShell gallery. It's on GitHub. I strongly encourage you to, if you're not already, go check out the GitHub repo. A whole slew of information is available there, documentation, all the good stuff. You can get DBA tools from Chocolatey. And chances are, if you're working in a data center to deploy SQL Server, you're probably going to do offline installations. And so check out that link there to get DBA tools in an offline kind of way. Now, it's one of the points actually that I wanted to jump back to DSC is versioning of modules is also a big challenge that I had to solve, or was a challenge that was hard to solve inside of DSC with DBA tools. Since I'm going to be driving the installations from a centralized location, that kind of mitigated that issue or challenge that I had. So we'll see that in play. Now, I generally don't put this much text on a screen, but I just wanted to highlight this is all of the stuff that DBA tools can do. So maybe just take a second to appreciate the awesomeness of the DBA tools module. So you can deploy AGs. My favorite bucket of commandlets is backup and restore. If you're looking at DBA tools for the first time, that if you see that functionality, it will blow you away. We're going to focus on the installation and deployment commandlets in today's session. So let's go ahead and jump into that. So in PowerShell, a commandlet is effectively a way for me to call a function to do some work, right? And so the commandlet to install SQL Server, deploy SQL Server is install DBA instance. And that gives me the ability to install a SQL Server. And it really requires only one thing, some installation files, right? I could walk up to a server, log into a server and say, install SQL Server on this machine and just point it at the network location that, or even the local drive that the files, the installation source files are in. But that's not a good candidate solution for scaling out. I'm going to show you how we can leverage this commandlet and extend it to manage installations at scale with all of the goodness that we talked about earlier. And so let's look at that solution architecture. So if I have to go to a customer site, this is kind of the big picture of how we're going to roll out SQL Server at scale. So I'm going to get some sort of administrative workstation or desktop, jump box, whatever you want to call it. That's where I'm going to install all of my tooling, the modules, VS Code, whatever it is that I'm going to use to drive the installations, right? And generally, I'm not going to do these kind of deployments with automated pipelines or things like that, because it's going to be a scenario where they come to me and say, Anthony, I need you to do these things, deploy this number of SQL servers. And ideally, I can take this code and give it to the local DBAs to run with it. And they kind of just take that and make that part of their deployment pipelines. Now, I have another thing which I'll call a deploy server, which effectively is just a file server on the network. And on that deploy server, We're going to have our installation sources. So I'll show you in a second when we get into the demos that's where effectively I've cracked open all of the ISOs for all of the versions of SQL Server that I need, 2012, 14, 16, 17, 19, and so on. In addition to the actual installation media that's going to be available to me on a network share on a deploy server, is I'll also have the update sources. And if you're not familiar with update sources are a way for me to put effectively the cumulative updates or service packs on a network share, and then I can tell the installation to slipstream that patch into the installation. So rather than just installing RTM and then coming back later installing a CU, it'll take those two, merge them together, and drop down whatever CU is available in that share. And I'll show you how that pieces together in the code when we get into that. Now, in addition to the deploy server, we're going to have a target server. That's basically the server that I want to install SQL Server on. That deploy server and target server should be physically adjacent in the same data center, because what I want is that target server to have high-speed network access to the installation media so that goes fast. There's no technical requirement on that other than you want it to happen quickly. Of course, you could do it over a WAN, but that would be painful. Now, what I'm going to do is drive the installation from the admin desktop. So I'll call that install DBA instance commandlet, which will execute over PowerShell remoting and send the appropriate commands to install SQL Server on that target instance. Once that kicks up, it'll start reading the installation files from the deploy server. Boom, we have SQL Server installed on that target system. Now, this is the big picture. Let's dig a little bit deeper into how I'm doing this for real in customer sites. So step one of the solution is going to be build a virtual machine template. In that VM template, I'm going to kind of bake in the persistent things that aren't going to change inside the operating system. So things like page file size, page file location, NTFS allocation unit on drives or in volumes, anything that really needs to be, that's going to be persistent and fully baked. In addition to the OS stuff that's not going to change frequently, I'll also add in the VM configurations, right? There's certain virtual machine configurations that work well for SQL Server, and those that can be fully baked into the image and template it so that I can just go to the systems team and say, hey, give me 5 Windows servers. And they'll go and crank out 5 Windows servers, join them to the domain, and then I can go and deploy SQL Server on top of those. We'll talk about the details of what goes into that template momentarily. Now, the next part of the deployment process, once I get the VMs from the systems team, is I'll use Pester, the testing framework, to execute a series of preflight checks, or preflight checks on the operating system itself and the host, or in the VM potentially. What those preflight checks do is validate that the thing that I got from the systems team is in the configuration that I think that it's in, so that I can successfully install SQL Server, right? Are the right drives there? Is the page file in the right location? Can the virtual machine that I want to install on, can that reach the installation server, right? The deploy server, which has the media, and go through those checks. And we'll look at those in more detail momentarily. The next part of the process is going to be the actual installation, right? So once I know I can install and I get green from the Pester tests, then I'll go and install SQL Server. And I can do it once, I can do it 10 times, 5 times, whatever it is, and get that done in my environment. Once SQL Server successfully finishes, then I'll execute a configuration phase. With the configuration phase is effectively a collection of PowerShell commandlets and functions that I'm going to execute against that target instance to get that system in the desired state that I want it to be in terms of both operating system config that might need to change and SQL Server config. And I'm going to use DBA Tools for all of that. And then once we're done the installation and configuration phase, I do another set of Pester tests, which I call the post-flight checks, which are going to make sure that everything I did in that configuration phase actually got done, just to confirm that the system is in the actual desired state that I want it to be in. And so let's walk through each one of those big gray arrows in a little more detail. Let's look at that VM template section a little more closely. And so what we want inside of here is to get kind of the configuration best practices that are extremely static, the things that just aren't going to change very often. And so from a VM standpoint, the actual virtual machine configuration will do things like disable CPU hot plug and make sure that we have the correct PV-SCSI network adapter or PV-SCSI adapters and network adapters exposed into the VM's configuration itself. Now, today is not going to be a deep dive into VMware best practices, but check out that link there to get into more detail about what you can and should configure inside the virtual machine for SQL Server to make it perform best. The other thing that I do for customers is I also standardize on drive topology. In the sense that I want volumes and folders that are going to be the same across the environment. So I'll do things like data, tlogs, and system. And then from there, when I build this VM template, each one of these volumes will be 5 or 10 gigs in the base image. When I request the image, that's when I'll have the operations team expand it to the appropriate size that it needs to be for the workload. Now, there are going to be, let's say, if you're the multi-terabyte, petabyte, have to parallelize across multiple disk kind of team, you might have to deviate from this here. But most of my customers are generally medium-sized businesses that aren't going to be banging up against those massive data sets. So this is an effective solution for that. Now, in addition, you could, like I said earlier, we can bake in the NTFS allocation units and any other operating system best practices that we need. Things like power plan and swap configuration and all of that should be fully baked into the VM template. Seal that up, put it in as a VM template, and the next time you need a VM from your network team or your systems team, it's as simple as a phone call away or a ticket away to get. Now, the second part, after I have that VM template built and I've requested one from the operations team, is I need to do what I call the pre-flight checks, right? Let's talk through what we can check in the system. We're going to use Pester to drive this work, and we'll look more closely at what a Pester test looks like momentarily. So one of the first checks that we need to do is to make sure that WinRM is available on the target instance. And WinRM is a way for me with PowerShell to execute commands remotely against the target system. And I need to make sure that that's there so that I can run the install DBA instance commandlet and other commandlets. We'll make sure that the service accounts that are defined are available and valid. So we'll test the credentials, right? The last thing I want to be able to do or try to do is install SQL Server and the service account that I'm feeding into the installer is not valid or has the wrong password or whatever it is. We'll do the same thing for the installation account. That's the actual account to execute the installer. And in our demos today, you're going to see it's going to be me, but I could feed in an automation account if I needed to. Since I'm going to make some assumptions in our configuration tasks later about drive topology and where things land from a foldering standpoint, I want to make sure that the drives that I expect to be there are there. Like if I need a D drive, I want to make sure that a D drive's there. If I wrote code that's dependent on a D drive being there or a T or S or whatever it is, I want to make sure that that's all available. I also want to make sure that the system that I'm installing to can reach the actual installation share and also the update sources share. And so with that, I then can know that the system is in a valid state before I go and kick off the actual installer, is to give me some confidence that I can successfully install. What's Pester? He's like, he keeps talking about Pester. Okay, well, Pester is a testing framework. And it basically gives me the ability to write some code, execute it against the target system, and inspect the output and have a test that says, is this a valid output? Is it within a particular range? Is it a particular discrete value? And run that code, I get the result, I inspect the result, and then the test is either going to pass or fail based on the parameters that I've written in the test, right? And so we're going to use this for both our pre and post configuration tasks, which we've described. But we can also use this, especially that post configuration test that's going to make sure the system's in the final configured state. I could run this a week later or a month later or whenever later and measure configuration skew. I can have that Pester test that has the desired state of my system and find out if somebody changed max stop or somebody changed max server memory or whatever settings that it is. And then I can find out if that changed. I can also use it to assert desired state, which, I don't know. It might be kind of an abuse of the platform. But if I did fail a test, like somebody changed max stop to 1, I could write additional code inside the Pester test to change that back to a valid value. Now, for me as a consultant, basically what I'm going to see is I'd rather just know so then I can then inform my customer that things have changed, but you can do that. I do want to call out that in addition to the solution that we're talking about today, if you're going to do this in your data center and you're something that you want maybe for a little bit longer term than just a point solution to test, like I'm describing, is check out DBA checks. DBA checks is built on top of Pester, and it goes above and beyond what I'm describing here to really kind of manage the information that's being exposed by the Pester test. For me, when I'm doing this as a point solution for a customer, I just want to know, am I in the desired state? Cool. DBA checks will help you manage your state over time, right? Things like backups and configuration skew. It's a fantastic tool written by the DBA Tools and PowerShell community. So check out that link there for more information. So what is a Pester test? Let's look at some code. So in a Pester test, we're going to define something that we want, basically a context. Or a context is basically something that we want to validate or test. In this case, I want to make sure that a SQL Server is accessible via WinRM. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to use some code. So it's going to be some PowerShell, right? And so what this test is going to do in this particular case is going to run the test net connection commandlet against the target instance. And way there over on the right, you see common TCP port WinRM. Basically, I'm testing to see if WinRM is available. I'm going to take that result and store that in that variable result. Now I'm going to write a clause that says the target server should be accessible via WinRM. That's just a string that describes the test that I want to run. Now I'm going to inspect that value. So there you see result pipe should be true, right? I want to make sure that the value that I got back from test net connection, which is going to be Boolean, is true because I want to make sure that it's available to me. And then I can add some additional information to the test with the minus because parameter there that says, because we need to do stuff with WinRM during the installation, right? That's the reason the test has to pass. We close that brace, Congratulations, we just wrote our first Pester test. Just to get another example, here we can see the context for a SQL Server account validation. And so this test here is going to call another commandlet. In this case, it's actually a function that I have in the source code that I'm going to use rather than a commandlet from a module. This function tests an AD credential. And so it takes a PS credential object and goes and checks the username and password to make sure that this thing could validate against or is a valid set of credentials. That test AD credential commandlet function returns a Boolean value. So then we're going to have a test that says that credential test result should be true because we need SQL Server to use a valid user account. And so we could take this framework and over and over and over again, write multiple tests to make sure that we're in the right state before we install. What tests do you need for your platform? Well, the ones I'm going to give you today in the code and the ones that we'll walk through in a demo are kind of a core set of things that we need, but there might be more advanced stuff that you need in your environment. You can go as far as you need with writing your Pester test to support that pre-configuration of those pre-flight checks. And so here's some sample output from a Pester test. Green is good. So there at the top, we see executing script, test pre-installation checks, and it goes through and you can see that first check that we wrote there. We can see that the context is the server needs to be accessible via WinRM. We get a green line that says the target server should be available. If that test failed, we would see some red and also a warning or an error message at that point. We see the next test that we wrote, service account validation, and it goes so on where I have the additional tests in our pre-flight checks.
Hey, Anthony, is Pester, is that a separate piece of software or is that just something that comes with PowerShell as it is?
Good question. It's a community module that is an older version of Pester comes with Windows. Newer versions of Pester, Pester 4 are just modules that you would install either from the gallery or manually, just like you would DBA Tools. Cool. Good question. So now that we kind of have that part, the pre-installation, pre-flight checks part of the process described, let's go a little bit deeper into the actual installation of SQL Server and look at kind of the internals or what we need to use or configure for install DBA instance. And so we need kind of a bunch of different things because we can get pretty far with our configuration just with this singular commandlet. Well, what we're going to need is the actual installation media. And we talked about where that's going to be stored on the network. Well, that's going to be passed, the location of the installation media is going to be passed into the install DBA instance commandlet. The next thing that we'll need is to define which version of SQL Server that we want to install, 17, 19, 14, whatever it is. We'll want to describe or define the features so we can install the engine, analysis services, reporting services, and so on is part of this installation process. We'll define an instance path or where we want to install SQL Server 2. Conventionally, that's going to be C program files, but in your organization, it might need to be a separate location, whatever that is. And then also we could define the default file locations for things like databases and logs and backup files and so on. On top of those, in our script today, we're going to go a little bit further and use some more of the parameters that are exposed from install DBA instance and define additional administrative accounts. So one of the things that we could do in the installation process is say, you know what, I want this AD group to be part of the system. I hope my brain always reboots when I say this. The sysadmin fixed server role. We can also define explicit feature credentials. So I can have a credential for the engine, a credential for the agent and analysis services and so on. Now, when I built the automation that I worked with DSC for customers, there was a problem that I had I couldn't quite solve is how can I expose additional configuration parameters that weren't part of the DSC module. And it was kind of a hard thing to solve. And I kind of bumped my head up against this problem for a while and threw my hands up in the air and just said, you know what, we'll deal with this in a post configuration task. Well, the developer that wrote this module, Kirill, solved this problem, this advanced configuration problem in the simplest and most elegant way. And we're going to look at this in more detail momentarily, in that this part of the installation process is just an extension into another hash table. And then we can feed in advanced configuration parameters like actually the update sources is not exposed as a parameter for the install DBA instance commandlet. It's actually part of the core SQL Server installation, but not a parameter for install DBA instance. And something like the browser service is starting or stopping that or setting its state during the installation isn't part of the commandlet itself, but is part of the SQL Server install. And he exposed that information as an additional hash table. So a simple but elegant solution to that problem. We'll see that in more detail momentarily. Other things that we can do right off the bat with the installation is set the appropriate security for the perform volume maintenance security context. Is that what that's called? So that we can get instant file initialization. And if needed, we can tell SQL Server to restart after the installation. So all of those big blocks turn into this, right? A lot of code. And so don't worry about the actual code that I have on the screen here, but just big picture, these are kind of the core things that we're going to use to install SQL Server today. The technique that I'm going to use to help keep the code clean, because it is a lot, is a technique called PowerShell splatting. So what you see there is installation parameters equals, and then I'm initializing a hash table. And then I go through and I enumerate all of the options that I want. So there we see the actual SQL instance. That's going to be the computer name. We see the path, which is going to be the actual location of the installation files. We see the version, so 2019. So we see features, engine, and so on, right? All these different parameters. Now, I could, of course, call the commandlet directly and feed all of that across like one big giant line, but this makes the code a lot more readable when you're looking at it in an IDE. You take that hash table and you pass that into install DBA instance, and you call the hash table with installation parameters, and you get a nice cleaner representation of the code. So with that, that's going to get us about 80% of what we need configured on our target instance. So default installation paths, we're going to have additional security accounts passed in, our engine credential, our agent credential. All of that stuff is configured inside of this one commandlet.
Is there like a way or like a workaround to get like every single thing that you would find on the wizard in here? Or are there just a couple of blind spots?
That's where this comes in.
There we go.
Yeah, good question. So and I kind of touched on this a second ago with advanced configuration and kind of that simple but elegant solution. that is part of the commandlet that Kirill developed is these kind of more advanced or custom installation options. Things like update sources and browser are going to be the ones I'm going to show you today. And I have a link. Actually, let me just jump ahead. So this here at the bottom, this link, if we browse to that URL, what you're going to find is all of the exposed parameters for the SQL Server installation that are part of installing SQL Server from the command prompt. So effectively anything you would see in the wizard as well. All of those options, and there's dozens of those, right, can be passed into, I'm going to back up here, this configuration parameter, right? So if you go back to this screen here, about 3/4 of the way down, you see configuration equals $ configuration. That's going to be a hash table that I could then go and define any additional parameter that is surfaced as part of the SQL Server installation process, but might not be part of the commandlet itself. So those, I don't want to say edge cases, but those dustier corners of SQL Server installs can be dealt with without additional code having to be supported in the commandlet itself. The one that we're going to use today is update source, which enables the patching of SQL Server during the installation process. If you want, though, you can also feed in actual configuration.ini if that's kind of core to how you deploy SQL Server. And then there's that link there. So let's do it. Let's go ahead and run some Pester tests together and install a SQL Server. So I have recorded my demos, which I generally only use as a backup plan, but I was having some crazy Kerberos issues in my lab. That's pretty much what it boils down to. And I didn't want to have the scope belly up during the installation. And so what we have here is the solution loaded up in VS Code. And this code is available for download as part of the downloads for the session. Don't go run this in production, please. Look at the code, use it as a prototype to build your own solution. Pretty please. So let's go ahead and walk through what we have here. Now, this first kind of block of code that I have at the top is kind of an initialization phase, right? On the line 2 there, I have an environment equals lab. I have another script that says import environment settings. And then I have a parameter called data center environment, which is going to pass in that parameter lab. And then I have 2 additional functions that I'm declaring my test AD credential function, which I described earlier, that tests the AD credential, and then also invoke SQL configure, which is a function that I'll use to actually configure SQL Server. And so let's walk through what each one of those 3 things does. The first one is import environment settings. I want to be able to have some portability in how I install this. So you can see here, I have one for data center 1 and one for lab, because my lab configuration is certainly going to be different than my actual production configuration. This way I can have a parameter that loads different configurations based on where I'm deploying. What do those configurations look like? Let's go ahead and, so here we can see I'm going to go ahead and describe that I can call the 2 different functions that are available. So on the left here, you can see I have import lab environment settings. So inside here is a collection of somewhat fixed variables that might change over time that I'm going to load that I use to configure SQL Server. And so we can see things like the actual domain that I'm installing, and that's going to read from an environment variable, potentially the number of physical cores per CPU, which helps me understand the NUMA topology at a target site, so that I make sure that I make right decisions about MaxTop. You can see the installation paths, which just went by a second ago. So there we see how I want to target the installation on the system and where I want certain types of data to live on the volumes on the target systems that I want to deploy. I have a log file because I love reading log files, because if something goes bump in the night during the installation, I want to know, and I'll go look there and read that output. Now, the install route is that deploy server, right? That's where I'm going to park all of the installation files and crack open the ISOs, extract them, and leave them there. On there, I then have a share or a folder for each version of SQL Server that I need to deploy. So there we see 2012 all the way up to 2019. And in our example today, we're going to deploy 2019. This too is a hash table, and I'll show you how we access that value momentarily when we call that code in a few seconds. Now, update sources. In that particular location is where I'll put the CU that I want to deploy that's slipstreamed into the actual installation. So, in this case, I think it's CU8, maybe CU6 for 2019 in the recorded demo here. So with that, we have our environment configuration, right? Which I could have separate environment configuration files for other networks and configurations or whatever it is. And we're going to load up some additional functions. Now on lines 9, 10, and 11, that's where I'm defining the version. So there I'm going to install 2019. I'm going to name the server. The server that I want to install to is DBA SQL 1. And I'm installing the features engine. It could be engine, analysis services, reporting services, and so on. What parameters you need to put there are available in that documentation link. The actual string values you need to put are available in that documentation link I just referenced a few seconds ago in the presentation. So let's go ahead and run that to load those variables. And then we'll jump ahead and do some credentialing information. So I'm going to use a service account to install for SQL Server to run as, and that's on line 14. And then I define a password. It's my favorite password, Ben, something so strong, it shows up again. Now, this is statically inserted here. In the production systems that I've built with this will pull from some sort of password management utility in an automated way. But for simplicity and kind of self-containment, I changed that to an actual string. We then build up a PowerShell credential or PS credential object, which is required by the install DBA instance commandlet. And so that's just loading the variables. And then on line 17 there, I have a get credential function call, which is then going to ask me for my credentials, because at the bottom there you can see this is who I'm going to install SQL Server as. I'm going to run the installer as my lab account, but the engine will run as that engine credential account.
Could I also install using a service account?
Yes. Yeah. That gets into an interesting, I don't say a philosophical debate, but a security debate on like having a privileged account in sort of automation. And I believe Chrissy and Rob addressed that in their book, which I have a link to the book at the end of the session here today. This is kind of the security considerations of having a singular automated account for that installation. But yes, good question. Whoops, I forgot to pause while I took a drink of water. So here's the structure of our Pester test. So on line 21 there, we see invoke Pester, and I'm going to call that script that is on line 22. We pass in the required parameters for the things that we need from a variable standpoint that we want to test. So the name of the server, the credentials that we want to test, and also the installation update sources. If I jump into the test, we'll see that some of the similar tests that we walked through in the presentation portion of the session, where we talk about the pre-installation checks for WinRM, service account, and so on. We also have some other tests for service account validation and the network shares. Again, you can extend these tests to go as far as you need for your environment. So let's close that out, save that up, and run that Pester test. And also I'm going through and highlighting the code and executing it serially and watching the output for demonstration purposes. This certainly could all be run in one fell swoop, and then it'll short circuit and break if something fails, right? So at the bottom there, we can see, similar to the output in the presentation, all of the different tests have executed against the target system. 12 tests have passed, 0 tests have failed. So now I can move forward and say I can get some pretty good confidence that the SQL Server installation is going to succeed. Cool. Move forward. I also make use of regions in the code so you can collapse the things. So at the top here, we can see line 39. This is kind of that advanced configuration stuff that I described in the presentation. The values that I'm going to get here came from that Microsoft documentation that I referenced. And what we're doing here is creating a second hash table, right? So configuration equals @ curly brace. And then inside of there, we define the keys and the values for the hash table. So update sources, and then the value for that. And then also another parameter, which is a browser service startup type, which is automatic in this scenario. It could be disabled, manual, whatever you want it to be. So going down a little bit further, we can see all the parameters that we looked at briefly in the presentation portion, things like SQL instance, which is the target server that we're installing to, the actual installation sources path, version, and so on. Now in line 54 here is where we reference that other configuration variable, which is another hash table. And so that's how we can get a complete installation picture. I also have restart set to true and verbose set to true because I love seeing output in when the installation runs. You can turn that off, obviously, for one, for performance reasons. Two, it just doesn't need to be there if this is automated. So we take all of that code. We're going to run install DBA instance. We're going to splat the parameter into the function or into the commandlet, and then capture the result as some output because we're going to get some valid output to look at. Then we're going to look at the output and then test for success because the way that the output is formatted, I'll be able to see what happened in test to make sure that the install completed successfully. If it went wrong, you'll get some pretty good value. You'll get an error code surfaced, and you'll also get a location to the log file on a target instance. If something failed, that's generally the first place that I go look at is the failed installation log on the target instance. And in a second, we'll see that output.
So while that's running, one quick question on the ISOs. So when you're providing the sources, is it sufficient to just load the ISOs or should they be mounted or unpacked or anything?
I'll extract them such that the executable is exposed. So it's just if you had the ISO, right click, expose or extract or whatever it is.
All right, gotcha.
Cool. So for the impatient of you, like me, when I'm running this install, I kind of just want to know, especially if I'm working with this solution for the first time, I want to know, like, is it actually doing what I think it's doing? And the process that you want to look for on the target system, this is the target virtual machine. Right there in Task Manager, you can see Scenario Engine. And that means the installer is running on the target system. You might see like MSI exec if it's doing the process of slipstreaming in the cumulative update. But that's a good way for you just to get some comfort when you're working with this kind of deployment for the very first time. Move that off screen. Now, this, I did some video magic to make this a little bit shorter because it takes about 5 minutes and I didn't want to have us have to wait for 5 minutes during the install. But here's the output. The output's fantastic because one, we can test against the output and look at successful equals true, restarted equals false. There, and Ben, this could answer your question a little more discreetly. What was the installer actually used, right? And so we saw how I kind of built up the parameters in the PowerShell files in the environment settings PowerShell file. And inside of there, I basically, because of the way that the hash function, the hash table works, is I'll go all the way out and define the executable. The commandlet itself does the heavy lifting to find the install executable. We don't have to specify it. We just have to give it a valid location.
Okay.
Exit code is 0.
Yeah. Full disclosure, I'm not coming up with smart questions. We have very smart attendees that do that day. So they make me look good.
Cool. Thank you, attendees, for the good questions. Exit code is 0, which is what we want. If it was any other value, then basically just go Google the value. You'll also get, I believe you'll get the last error. So if you did something like had the wrong password, which we tested for, it would surface here. And if anything goes wrong, just go look at this file, right? And if you're familiar with invoke command, you could, over remoting, go grab the content of that file and have it pop back here on the central installation system if you needed it to. And so with that, we have SQL Server installed on that target system, right? In a pretty consistent way. If I need to do that 5 times, 10 times, no big deal. So let me show you. Oh, yep. I want to bring this up. There you can see the agent running. And so their agent is running and SQL Server is running. But we're not going to trust our eyes on that. We're going to write tests to confirm that. And so let's jump back into the presentation and talk about our post installation configuration checks. How are we doing on time, Ben? About 20 minutes left?
Yes, pretty much exactly 20 minutes. And
Sweet.
by the way, can I ask just another question? Because I mean,
Yeah.
if you had gotten like a proper moderator, he would have asked you that before. Will you be
Mhm.
providing the code to the attendees after this?
It should already be on the in the conference portal. I uploaded it
Excellent.
with the PDF for the deck, which I've already found corrections because you only find those when you're presenting live. And two, I zipped up the code and it's available there. I will
Awesome.
caution you, like I said earlier, team, don't run that code in production. Use it as a template to build your own solution, please.
Don't try this at home.
Don't please try this at home, just not at work or in production. So invoke SQL configure is a function that I wrote and a friend of mine at one of my customers contributed significantly to because he's a much better coder than I am. Is it's a custom PowerShell function that does the post installation configuration task. So we're going to walk through the code momentarily, but basically anything that I want to configure, I'm going to inside the instance, I'm going to do it here. So things like max server memory, min server memory, max stop, ad hoc, uh, optimization for ad hoc queries, any of those instance level configurations that I need that I want on the target system. And it could be, and I try to keep this against or keep the functions that I'm calling inside this custom function, the DBA Tools commandlets, because I don't like maintaining code. I love being able to go to DBA Tools, download a new module or a new version of the module and have the community maintain that code so that I can, reap the benefits of that quality and also the features. And as we learned earlier, the goal of the project is pretty much anything that's exposed in SSMS is going to be surfaced as a commandlet. And so we can bake all of that into this invoke SQL configure script. And so what you'll see is a series of DBA tools commandlets and also some additional code wrapped around DBA tools commandlets to get the system in the configuration that I really want it to be in. So that's effectively what this invoke SQL configure function does, which we saw me import in the second or third line of code when we were in the demos a few minutes ago. Now, here's the key thing about this function is I want it to be what's called idempotent, which means I can run this code against the target system over and over and over again. And if it runs, or let me say this more accurately. If there's nothing to change, it's just going to leave it alone. If there's something to change, it's going to change it, right? Or at least tell me that I want to change it. And the idea is I can then take this invoke SQL configure script and run it against an instance a month after it's deployed, a year after it's deployed, and get it back into the desired state. And that's kind of core to how we can maintain the configuration of the system over time, right? And fix configuration skew and also measure skew with Pester, which we'll talk about momentarily. So inside of invoke SQL configure, I've kind of already described it in pretty good detail, it's a function that then goes and has either a collection of additional functions or direct calls against DBA tools commandlet. So for example, if I need to do something like disable SA login, well, I'm going to have some code that's going to go and do something like this. I'm going to get all the logins. I'm going to filter the output for SA, and I'm going to make sure it's disabled. The DBA tools commandlet get DBA login, or excuse me, set DBA login. If it's already disabled, it's not going to do anything. If it is disabled, it's just going to disable it for me. I can take this code and run it against an instance and get that affected configuration on the target instance. And I can do this for any configuration parameter that I want. Basically, inspect the parameter and run it against the target instance. In this case, that's going to be disabling SA login. I think I have like 20 or 30 example configurations in the function that we're going to walk through now. So let's go ahead and look at that. So the next part of our demo is going to be invoke SQL configure. And in this file, and this is available for download, you're going to see a whole slew of things. And the first one that we have is, configure page file. You can see in the code here, it's statically set the values that I know are safe for this particular environment. That's why I said, don't run this in your environment without reading the code. I left things around that are going to break. And what this is going to do is on line 8, I'll get DBA page file settings. So what are the page file settings on the target system? And then on lines 9 through, on line 9, I'm testing. Well, is it in the location that I want it to be in? Is it the size that I want it to be in? If it's not, change it, right? And then you'll see that pattern throughout this code in this function. I can't control how fast the video goes. I don't want to fast forward because then I'll be like jumping back and forth. So the next one is going to be, go down a little. Yeah, I think I will fast forward. Come on, you can do it. There we go. The next one I'm going to do is I'm going to add a local member or a local, a group to the local administrators group on the target instance in the event that I need that as part of my config. Moving forward, we have, let's see, I'm adding some logins here. There's the disable login function there that we walked through in the presentation. And then the next function on line 64, if I need to configure trace flags, I have some code in there. Let me back up. I want to show that. That does certain operations based. This is what I didn't want to do, is jump all around in the video. That's going to run certain trace flags on certain versions of SQL Server because the default trace flags changed based on the version that you're on. I also have settings for configuring a model database. So the idea here is there's a collection of functions that will go and execute that code against a target instance to get me in the desired state. Here's one for configuring SQL Mail. It creates both an account and a profile. I also have settings for agent. So each one of those functions is defined, but I still have to call those functions. And that's what the invoke SQL configure function does here at the bottom. Here's where I'm calling bare DBA Tools commandlets just because I don't have to have additional code around them to help it make the right decision. So there I'm setting the power plan, setting max stop, max server memory, and I'm taking the best practice configurations in there. Each one of these commandlets can be parameterized with custom values for your deployment if needed. So there's a couple other ones I want to call out in there. So there you can see I'm installing Ola Hallengren's maintenance solution, who was active. And then there we can see the calls to the custom functions at the bottom to configure trace flags and so on. Run that code, and that goes through and configures all of those values in the target instance. Now, in real life, when I'm not kind of describing this in gory detail as part of a presentation, we're on probably, like, if this is my test lab, the sixth minute in the deployment. Like, happens pretty quickly. On enterprise hardware, this takes probably 2 or 3 minutes to get to this point. So it's really nice to have that automation. So that's kind of the big bucket items to configure SQL Server, right? But I want to make sure that it's actually in the state that I think it is. And that's where Pester comes in again. And I'm going to engine and so on. Any accounts that were added or disabled, I want to write Pester checks to make sure that those are set. I'm also, to the bane of every DBA in the universe, check if the SPNs are configured properly. There's some great commandlets in DBA Tools that help me make sure that the SPNs are configured appropriately. And even if you're doing an availability group configuration, you can extend that code and test for the listener and all the individual instances and so on against an individual service account. You can bake that code in to this test before you go into production and know that things are in a valid state. We'll test all of the instance settings and also so things like SP configure options, trace flags that I need to configure. We'll set agent settings and jobs. I like the SQL agent to be configured a particular way. One thing that's not included in here is installing Glenn Berry's alerts, right? That's a very valuable tool in a lot of environments and making sure that those are there. And so writing tests to make sure that those are available. Also, any database specific settings or instance stored procedures like who is active, right? Or any of the ones associated with Ola Hallengren's maintenance solution. So you can expand these tests as far as you need to solve the, to make sure that your instance is in the state that it needs to be before you hand it off to the next team that needs to do whatever it is to deploy their applications and their databases on top of the system. You know it's in a valid state because you wrote code to test it. You got this nice green screen like I have here that goes through the Pester test. So there we can see a couple of tests for, is the agent up and running? Is there a SQL Server agent operator, right? And that test actually goes a notch further to make sure that there's a valid email address associated with that operator. Going down a little bit further, we see the agent history retention settings. Is Ola Hallengren's stuff installed? Yes, and green is good. You pass all the tests. And so let's go ahead and look at that code in this part of the presentation. So line 73, yes.
About 10 minutes left.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we're bringing it in for a landing. So here on line 73, here is the function or the call to Pester to execute the test. And so let's look at the contents of that Pester test. So inside of here, we have all the tests that describe the desired state of the system. So there's the test for the agent configuration. And I'm trying to use DBA tool connects as much as possible. So get DBA service for the instance where the type is agent, get its state, store that as a result. A lot of the tests that I looked at in the previous Pester test were like Boolean values. So here I'm testing against a discrete value. So the result should be the string running because I want to make sure that SQL Server is running, right? Or the agent, so I should say. Now going further, the next one you can see get DBA agent operator. So this test is a little more advanced in that it's wrapped in a for each loop and it reads all of the operators and makes sure that at least one of those is named alerts and it has a valid email address associated with it. I should have let the video play while I was walking through all of that. So there's a test for database mail. There's another test for Ola Hallengren's solution. So there we can see I'm looking to make sure that all of the different stored procedures associated with Ola's solution is installed. I also have who is active hanging off of that test. And I also have some additional code for, hold on, I went back too far. Where is it? So one of the things that I do in this test here is I want to, if I'm writing this test at some time in the future, here's another example of just helping you understand the estate. Now, again, DBA checks is a much more better enterprise solution than this. But if I'm doing this as a point solution on a customer site, I could run this code again a week or a month later, and I'm going to get the install date. And if the install date is greater than 7 days, I check to see if things like the command log cleanup job ran, if integrity checks ran, if an index job, maintenance job ran, if that's your jam. And I can then build additional tests to help me understand the state of a system. And so at the bottom here, I'm going to run that Pester test and everything's going to go and it's going to check all of those values. If I had an installation checklist, I'd go get another cup of coffee, I'd come back and I'd go through and tediously have to do this for however many instances that it was. And this entire process ran in 13 seconds on this instance in my lab and checked 39 different tests. And those tests also consisted of additional configuration points well beyond 39. So how far can you take this? As far as you need for your environment, running those tests to get make sure that you're in a desired state for your target system. So let's go ahead. I think that's it for the demo. Yeah, that's it for that demo. And jump back to presentation. Cool. So as a recap, kind of the things that we went through today, we talked about why this is hard. Not why it's hard, but why do we want to do automation and rolling out and configuration management, things like that. We talked about the benefits, right? Why this is good. Basically you can leverage speed, efficiency, and even go so far as to claim high availability as part of the solution because you're going to build some automation. We looked at some candidate solutions and talked about the pain points of the couple of those and looked very closely at how to use DBA tools. We talked about OS templating, installing SQL Server, configurations of SQL Server, and also using Pester to manage our configurations. Now, I am going to take a few minutes to call out some of my favorite people in the SQL Server community that built this stuff. This isn't stuff like I built this thing that you see, but I'm literally standing on the shoulder of giants. Chrissy, Kirill, Rob, Jess, Claudio, Sanders, Stuart, all of these folks have contributed so much to our community and the value that the DBA Tools module is. And I'm literally almost getting misty. Wow. The impact, I'm actually quoted on the DBA Tools website and says the impact that this module has had on my career and our community, I literally think is immeasurable because of the things that we can achieve to get work done. I am a single person consultant. I can't scale. The only way I can scale is by using something like this to write code to help me manage more systems, right? And as an individual DBA or in a small team of DBAs that has a large data estate, this thing can help you solve a lot of problems of building automated solutions to make your life easier, more consistent, and make you kind of the A player in your org. So please, if you're not following these folks on Twitter, follow them on Twitter, engage with them. They're all super fantastic people. You can go to GitHub for help if you need more additional resources. They're also in Slack. If you post a question in Slack, you will likely get an answer almost immediately. No, there's no SLAs there. It's just been my experience. And Chrissy and Rob recently wrote a book that covers the DBA Tools module in much greater detail, or I guess more expansive detail across the whole module. And there is a chapter on this topic specifically, install DBA instance. So go ahead and check out that book, please. And thank you so much for attending. There's my contact information. If you have any questions, you want to hit me up on Twitter or shoot me an email, I will be readily available for that. So what's up, Ben?
Cool. First of all, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Second of all, I'm going to shoot a couple of very quick questions right at you.
Okay.
First of all, there is a small issue because apparently your demos are not to be found on the portal. And I've seen that with another session. Would you be fine if I just provide your GitHub account and you post it there?
I will. Yeah, let's do that real quick.
Cool. Okay. Just do it after the session. And then first quick question. Can I use this to install a SQL cluster?
I know you can do availability groups. I don't know if you can do failover clusters. Okay. I've built the code to do AGs. And I actually talked with Chrissy about this. For me, it was hard to generalize that, to make that publicly available, because it becomes very infrastructure specific for an organization. I don't know if that's covered in the book, but I know there are commandlets. Well, I did it. There's commandlets for installing and configuring AGs. So check that out.
All right, cool. Would you recommend doing a VM snapshot before installing?
Absolutely. Yeah. Until you get some confidence in your install process. Once your code is tested and you're just kind of running it over and over again, then yeah, you can probably let it go. The biggest thing is, how annoyed is your ops team going to be if you go back to them and ask them to recreate that VM for you, right? But yeah, you could build that into the process. You could use Power CLI, I think it is, for VMware. You could do a snap, do your business, and then if it's successful, just delete the snap, right? That's be something that you bake into your solution.
Speaking of VMware, you had a link to a best practice guide for SQL on VMware. Are you aware of something like a best practice guide on SQL on Hyper-V?
I am not. If anybody knows about that, I'll add that to the link. I'd like to say I've never used Hyper-V, but Azure.
So Matt, if you find the answer to your own question, let Anthony know and he will add it to the deck so you can answer your own question from Anthony's deck. How's that?
It's like a circular dependency.
How are you doing this with multi-threading? Would you do like a PowerShell RS job or just passing a list, or when you do like?
So I haven't gone that crazy with the parallelization. I imagine the easiest way to solve that problem would be PowerShell jobs and run that with the as job parameter, and then just back on the task and then poll against the completion statuses of those jobs behind the scenes.
All right, cool. And Steve is saying, this looks great for initial deployment and ensuring that config stays in sync with the initial deploy. How do upgrades or updates or getting changes to those open source tools like Who is Active, Ola's tools, and so on deployed? Would that be also part of what you can do with DBA tools, or would that be completely out of sync there? Or out of scope?
So yeah, that for me, just again, this as a point solution, as a consultant, I haven't had to worry about that, but I'm not going to leave you hanging. There are some of the DBA tools commandlets that will monitor for new versions of the DBA tools module. I don't know if it extends that down to things like Ola stuff and also SP Who is Active. You could probably pretty easily write a Pester test that goes that additional mile for you. Am I on the latest version, or have I skewed beyond that? I do know that there's a DBA tools commandlet for managing updates, and I think it'll tell you if you're behind. I think it will, but I imagine DBA checks is probably going to be a better way to solve that problem internally in a more enterprise fashion.
Got it. All right, and with this, I posted Anthony's GitHub link to the discussion, so please go there, and Anthony will be so kind and upload the demos to a folder up there after the session.
Mhm.
And with that, Anthony, famous last words. We're on time. Thank you so much for this.
I've never done that before. On time. Thanks, Ben, for moderating. I appreciate your assistance today.
My pleasure, always.
Cool.